Hello, this is Derek Hansen for StrengthPowerSpeed.com, and welcome to our 6th episode of our Performance Concepts Chat. This episode, we speak to Dr. Ken Clark about his recent research into sprinting, running, and ground reaction forces. And I was encouraged to talk to Ken because of a recent paper that was released by himself and Peter Weyand and Laurence Ryan. And the paper is A General Relationship Links Gait Mechanics and Running Ground Reaction Forces. And these individuals have collaborated on now 3 papers relating to running mechanics and ground reaction forces in the last number of years. And I was quite fond of the previous paper where I use a lot of their ground reaction force waveforms in my presentations. And so I finally got a chance to sit down and talk with Ken. And the great thing about Ken is that he's a researcher, so he's buried in the science, but he also works as a coach and works with athletes in track and field and other sports and field sports. So he gets to not only research high-speed running, but he gets to take that research and apply it in a practical setting and really kind of test, what he's found in the lab to see if it actually works in the real case scenario with field sport athletes, court sport athletes. And I think he's in an enviable position right now because he can work both ends. And if he sees something on the field, now he can go and suggest that, hey, maybe this is something we should research, which is very, very interesting to me. So in our talk, we get into his background as a coach and a researcher and some of the stuff he's been involved in. But also we get into the meat of the model that they've created. They have a 2-mass model, which is a simplified version of maybe multi-mass models, spring models that were used previously. And he also outlines a method by which, you or me as coaches can take a high-speed camera and evaluate, swing time and the way the foot hits the ground and just kind of estimating ground reaction forces by using simple technology, something that's in the palm of your hand, like a smartphone that can frame at 120 or 240 frames per second. So he talks a bit about that. And he also talks about, what he sees in the elite sprinter and how that applies to the field sport athletes that he works with, which I find very interesting. And really it does come down to creating ground force, downward force into the ground and having the stiffness and elasticity to take advantage of that force. So that's really interesting to hear him explain it in those terms. And, a lot of my questions are about, how is the work that you're doing in the lab influencing how you coach? Because I think as coaches, all of us try to, research in our own way. It might not be in a laboratory with really fancy equipment, but a lot of the stuff that I found very interesting, a lot of the stuff that Ken's doing and these other researchers are doing, intuitively I thought about as a coach, but I just didn't really have the means to prove it. So it's nice to really sit down with somebody and talk about the practical side, but also get some reinforcement from the scientific side. So I think you'll really enjoy this. I had a great time talking with Ken, and even once we shut it down, we talked a bit more, and I'm sure we'll be talking more in the future with Ken and just seeing where his research is going to take him, and hopefully it feeds back to people in the practical settings so they can be more effective. So I really hope you enjoy our talk with Dr. Ken Clark. Hey, Ken. Thank you for joining us. I know you're a really busy guy and you've got lots of young minds to educate on the run here. So, but I wanted to say that I've gone through the latest research paper, and again, I've used your stuff in the past to prove some points that I've been trying to make on using high speed running as part of training and preparation. And this is just another step forward in terms of people being able to analyze, at a very low cost and not much sophistication, to analyze how important this is and how important the ground contact and ground reaction forces are. Now, we're going to get into the study itself, and you can decipher and we can get into all the nerdy sprint work stuff. But can we get a little bit more information on your background. I know that you are a researcher, a sports scientist, but also a coach, and that's the part that interests me. Can you give us some details on your background, your education experience, and how you've kind of molded into this person you are right now?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I think you and I really think alike on a lot of different topics. So I'm really happy to speak with you today. Yeah, I guess my background is just probably as a frustrated athlete growing up who was never quite as fast as he wanted to be. I'm not a very big guy. I was a football player, running back. Always just trying to get faster so that I could play at the college level, even just at the small college level. I had a father who was a high school football coach as well as a speed coach, and so I was kind of always was working on my speed as a young athlete, and we kind of just got into some techniques that frankly were probably ahead of the times, just because my dad was always pushing the envelope. He was into looking at plyometrics and overspeed training, and when I was as young as 10 years old, so I kind of got exposed to some neat techniques just as an athlete with my father as my coach. From there, as I said, it really just grew as I was trying to get faster to play high school and college football, and then after I graduated college, my first job was as a Division III football grad assistant coach and speed coach, and it was kind of the same thing, trying to work with the athletes I was coaching and try to develop best practices for making them faster and really always just learn. From there, I transitioned from kind of the football world to just the pure performance coaching world. I had a private sector job at a place called Summit Sports here in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And at that time, I also decided to go back and learn a little bit more on the book side of things. So I got a master's degree in kinesiology and had some great mentors along the way. At Westchester, a professor named Dr. David Stern, who's now my colleague at Westchester, he kind of turned me on to the research side of things. Went down to Dallas, studied with Dr. Peter Weyand and Dr. Larry Ryan in the SMU Locomotive Performance Lab, where I did my PhD. But at heart of it, yeah, I'm really just a coach at heart. That's what I frankly enjoy the most. I enjoy teaching and I love the research aspect of it, but coaching and research to me always go hand in hand because coaches in my mind should be using research to help them develop better programs or coach their athletes better. And from a research standpoint, if we're doing research that doesn't have practical applications, well, then there's no point in doing it. So to me, I see it as one and the same. Right now, I'm really fortunate in that I have an overbooked schedule. I teach classes in biomechanics, motor learning, and kinetic anatomy at Westchester, and I'm a volunteer assistant strength coach with Westchester. I work with the track team, track and field, volleyball, and women's basketball. And then over at Haverford College, 2 days a week, I work with the men's soccer team currently doing speed development. They have one of the best strength and conditioning coaches in the country, in my opinion, my colleague Corey Waltz, who heads up things over there at Haverford College. So like to stay busy, and it's really fun kind of teaching, researching, and coaching.
Well, that's great. I mean, just listening to you and the work that you're involved in, it makes me think like sometimes we have people that are coaches, and they get into the art of coaching, and then we have the people who are the scientists, and you're kind of bridging that gap as an individual, which is interesting. But it brings me to my next question. When you're working with a coach who may not be as well versed on the science side, do you find there's ever conflicts where you're like, hey, look at this paper, it's got my name on it, you want to see the results, how come you're not listening to me? Do you ever get into those kind of dilemmas?
I try to avoid those as much as possible, and to be honest, I haven't really. I think the coaching field just as a whole is getting more progressive as far as, not necessarily basing all practices on science because it's a results-based world. So if what a coach is doing is working, is improving their athletes' performance and reducing the injury risk factors, and that's really all the evidence you need. But at the very least, I feel like many more coaches, most of the field at this point is more enlightened as far as trying to do a good job of at least be familiar with the science and the research, and that there's a great deal of people like yourself who also do a good job of kind of bridging that gap. Because to be honest, some of these research papers, it takes effort to translate them so that they're understandable, and so that's a necessary step in the process. All the experience I've had lately in terms of trying to bridge a gap between, doing research and coaching has been nothing but positive, where the coaches are just, open-minded and saying, hey, how can we use this research to help us coach better or understand performance better? So it's really been, just a positive from my standpoint. And I see the field as going that way. I mean, if there are dinosaurs left in the field who are anti-science, I don't see that as where the field is going in the future. So
Yeah, hopefully it is kind of a a minority thing where people are still holding these traditional values, and I do see it a lot still in certain sports, specifically like football still has a lot of traditional values.
yeah.
You know that, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, football, even though the game is near and dear to my heart, is typically the worst offender. When we see that sort of thing, a lot of times it does come in American football. So be that as it is, I guess.
Now, understanding, like I'm a running mechanics nerd like yourself, and I see the value in what you're doing. When you first got into some of this stuff, where did you know, or how did you know where to look in terms of the research and what you wanted to hone in on? And I know you had some people working with you and some mentors and all that, but what were the particular things that you said, we got to look at this a little closer?
Yeah, great question. So I feel really blessed. The training I had with Dr. Peter Weyand and Dr. Larry Ryan in the Locomotive Performance Lab at SMU, I wouldn't trade that for anything in the world. And kind of when I first got down there in 2010, Peter really ingrained in me that all good research, of course, has to start with a good research question and be hypothesis driven in nature, and that the best way to then test that hypothesis is to test it across a broad spectrum. So kind of as you're hinting at, how do we know what to look at? Well, we essentially looked at runners across a really wide spectrum of abilities, everybody from Olympians, and not just Olympians, but medal winners. I think in my 5 years there, we had 7 Olympians, including gold medal winners in the sprints and the relays and the hurdles, all the way down to competitive field sport athletes. So SMU's Division I soccer athletes and lacrosse players. So people who are fast but not competitive track and field athletes, and then all the way down to weekend warriors. So just average Joes off the street who could run okay, but who certainly weren't trained for it. And so by examining running mechanics across this really broad spectrum, and again, this was kind of how Peter trained me and how Larry helped me analyze the data. These broad sweeping differences are really well illustrated. These differences between what the Olympic sprinters are doing on one end of the spectrum, to the weekend warriors at the other end of the spectrum, to the field sport athletes in the middle. And so what we were looking for from a running mechanics standpoint, it jumped out at us as we analyzed these runners both across speeds and across their own top speeds. To just finalize kind of the answer to your question, Peter had a hunch based on his earlier research from both the Harvard lab and where else he had been beforehand, that elite sprinters not only applied more force down into the ground, more vertical force at top speed than intermediate and average runners, but that the pattern of force application was different. So that the force time waveforms, the force curves looked different, that there was this, as you termed it, a biosignature, if you will, for force application. We didn't know exactly what that looked like. We didn't know the specifics of it or what the mechanism was underlying it. But when I came down there to Dallas in 2010, Peter said, you know what? I have a hunch that these are the differences, that there's some difference in the pattern of force application. Let's investigate it by getting 100+ runners of varying abilities and testing them up to top speed on our instrumented force treadmill and analyze the data and see what pops out. And in fact, what was kind of beautiful and really fun to be a part of was there was this clear-cut difference in the force signature between an Olympic sprinter versus who has a top speed, a male Olympic sprinter of 25+ miles an hour, or 26 miles an hour, to a field sport athlete who's maybe at 20 or 21 miles an hour, to an average Joe who's somewhere between 16 and 18 miles an hour. across that spectrum, there was these clear delineations in their pattern of force application, which really, motivated three plus papers, and that's kind of the research that's recently come out. So
That's great. Now, this wasn't in my list of questions, but I always had this question about the efficacy of testing on a treadmill, a force plate type treadmill, versus over regular ground, and maybe having a force plate in the ground. Is there any difference? Is one better than the other?
yeah, I mean, I think the ideal situation would be 100 meters of force plates, and we'll test people on a 100-meter dash and get step by step analysis, and
That would be
obviously
awesome. That would be
that,
awesome, by the way.
that would
Yeah.
be awesome. I think there may be one lab in Asia that has something similar to that, where it's, I don't know, 50 or 60 meters
Wow.
of plates, and obviously that's a pretty incredible setup. At the current time in the United States, there that just doesn't exist, obviously. So the other options are running over a few plates, or if you have, 8 to 10 meters of plates, as JB Marin has done, constructing a 40 meter, virtual 40 meter dash by having people run over the plates at certain points. And I think, there's a lot of positives to either approach. All of the data that we have from our instrumented force treadmill, as well as our colleague Matt Bundle at University of Montana, who's got both plates in the ground, extended plates in the ground in a runway and a force treadmill, is that the data is essentially the same. Am I going to say that running on an instrumented force treadmill where you're just dropped down at top speed and there's not an acceleration phase, is that exactly the same as speeding up over ground where there's a drive phase and you're going through acceleration? No, obviously it's not exactly the same phenomenon for the runner, but are the forces and the motions that result from the testing nearly identical? I think yes. If you're on a high-speed motorized treadmill that had as fast a response rate as ours did, thanks in large part to Dr. Larry Ryan's instrumentation. So.
That's awesome. That's a great answer. Thank you. I just wanted to, bring that out because I know I've always been thinking like, because you run on a crappy fitness gym
Yeah.
treadmill and you're like, so. Can we strap on our nerd helmets here? And can you
Mine
talk?
is always on.
Okay. um, can we get into this difference between, say, past models of sprinting and high-speed running versus your two-mass model? So you've identified multi-mass spring models of the past versus what you guys have narrowed down to a two-mass model. Can you get into the details of that without
Yeah.
my head exploding?
No,
Yeah.
absolutely, and I'll try to tie it into some coaching applications as well. So really, it's kind of a three-part paper. We've published three papers over the course of that I don't know 5 year period, and most importantly was the one that came out in 2014, the Springs paper that looked at the force pattern signature of elite sprinters versus field sport athletes, and then that was directly tied together with this most recent paper that came out in 2017. So I'll backtrack just slightly to the 2014 paper, and what that paper looked at was we took our competitive sprinter group, both males and females. All of them had sprinted at the post-collegiate level or better, including several Olympians, and we compared them to field sport athletes that were highly trained. In other words, these were your Division I collegiate athletes, soccer, lacrosse, that sort of thing. And of course, the competitive sprinters ran faster, as we would all expect, with greater vertical ground reaction forces and shorter ground contact times. But it wasn't just that they were applying more force down in less time. It was that they had a different force signature, a different biosignature for high-speed running. While the field sport athletes applied force in an upside-down U-shape pattern, so kind of a bell-shaped curve that looks like a sine wave, kind of the classic spring mass model of force application, very smooth rising and descending edges to it. The elite sprinters had this clear force signature where there was this really high rate of force application in the first half of ground contact. Elite male sprinters, if they weighed 200 pounds, were hitting 1,000 pounds of peak force within the first 300ths of a second of ground contact, which from physical standpoint is almost unimaginable. I mean, imagine going into a weight room and putting 1,000 pounds on your back and jumping up and down, doing a one leg, hop, and we all, have our skeletons be crushed, of course. So there was something about the motion of the limb and the stiffness upon ground contact that was allowing for these high ground reaction forces to be applied. And it was this different signature. And that's what came out in that 2014 Springs paper. What we tried to do from there was say, okay, this is the force signature, but clearly the motion of the limbs in elite sprinters is also different than it is in our our field sport athletes. You don't need to be, a sprint coach to look at an Olympic sprinter in the 100-meter dash versus a soccer player at top speed and know that their sprinting technique is not the same. The Olympic sprinter has great posture, great front-side mechanics, an aggressive ground contact, strikes on the ball of the feet, stays stiff the entire time, limits their backside swing, whereas a field sport athlete probably has less postural integrity, more forward pelvic tilt, their booty sticking out behind them, to put it in less technical terms, more backside swing. They don't get the front side knee lift, and they have kind of a mushy ground application. Especially soccer players, we found they really strike on their toes. They're used to being plantar flex from always kicking the ball that way, and they kind of collapse into the ground. So inherently, as we were doing this force analysis, we know, well, the force is coming from the motion. It's not just that the Olympic sprinters are that much more weight room strong than the field sport athletes. In some cases, although we didn't measure strength, but in some cases it might be, quite the opposite. But the force was coming from the motion. And so what we soon kind of realized, or as we looked more at the kinematics, the motion data, and the kinetics, the force data, was that the velocity of the lower limb as it impacted the ground was much higher in the Olympic sprinters. To use a simple coaching term, they were cocking the hammer and striking the nail. So when they were throwing that punch towards the ground, that hammer was coming in at a much higher speed and striking much stiffer than for the field sport athletes. And it was that impact, that initial impact, that was causing the high forces to be applied in the first half of ground contact. To bring it back to your question, now that the stage has been set, and I apologize for the long-winded answer, previous multi-mass spring models have mostly been concerned with slow speed running, heel strike running, so differences in maybe, what rear foot strike runners do versus forefoot strikers do at jogging speeds, and been only interested, and I don't mean this in a bad way, just that this was the focus of the research, interested in predicting the first initial part of the ground contact phase. What are the impact forces when people kind of rear foot strike at slow to intermediate speeds? We were interested in what happens across the entire range of speeds, 3 meters per second to 11 plus meters per second, jog to a run to a sprint, and what happens with rear foot strikers, mid foot strikers, forefoot strikers, because we tested 100 plus athletes, so we had the whole mix. So the long story short is that multi-mass spring models have used a variety of different elements, sometimes upwards of 10 or 12 different variables in the mix, to predict just the first half of the ground contact phase in slow speed running. Again, absolutely nothing wrong with that. That was the goal of the research. We were trying to simplify it, and we quickly realized, hey, we can just basically look at the incoming velocity of the lower limb, how quickly it stops, i.e. the acceleration of the lower limb. That's mass 1, including the foot, the ankle, and the shank. And then there's this other mass that kind of rebounds on and off the ground. That's everything basically above the knee is mass 2. So that's our 2-mass model. And we can just use these factors, so the acceleration of the shank, and then just simple contact and flight time from the stride, which goes back to kind of Newton's laws, and we can predict the whole force waveform. So it not only had practical applications to this is why the sprinters are applying their force waveform the way they are, but also, hey, you know what? Not only is this good for sprinting performance and analyzing performance, but we can actually use this 2-mass model to predict waveforms for everybody, regardless of foot strike type, across speeds. So I hope I didn't go too far off on a tangent, but that was kind of the evolution of the thought process in the model.
And one of the things that I noticed too was that if you took somebody running, say, 7 miles per hour and you took an elite sprinter running 7 miles per hour, their signatures were similar. It wasn't that the fact this was an elite sprinter having a different technique, it was velocity specific. Am I right?
Yeah, great interpretation. Absolutely. So that goes back to the second paper that was published. Essentially, the force time curves there may be slightly different at the slow and intermediate speeds, but your point is correct. The faster runners, the competitive sprinters, are able to achieve those higher speeds because of their running mechanics, i.e., their posture, their thigh lift, their front side mechanics. They're attacking the ground, which then translates into their force signature, their much greater rate of force application in the first half of ground contact, their much higher vertical forces overall, and their much faster ground contact times. So yeah, the difference, we only saw the difference after, 8, 9 meters per second. It was basically pretty similar up through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then once you got into that elite sprinting range, that's really when that competitive sprint signature really came out. So if we didn't have, it's such a great lab down there, Peter's lab at SMU with Larry kind of overseeing the instrumentation. If we didn't have the second fastest treadmill in the world, and if we weren't able to recruit all of those competitive sprinters to come test in the lab, that signal, we would have never been able to interpret that signal across those high speeds. So.
Yeah, and that's great for someone like me. And I had told you that I had taken some of your waveforms and some of your conclusions from the 2014 paper. I presented them at the NFL Combine because I said, look, if we run slow and the GPS data shows that in practice and even in games, the speeds aren't that high because of all the constraints and the duration of practice and somebody's trying to tackle you and all that. So the speeds are not that high. So we can't rely on just practice to address our speed, adaptation needs. Like we actually have to run fast in a separate session, and I think that's a problem is people are actually detraining by just playing their sport.
Yeah, I'm clearly very biased on this subject, but I'm biased, I think, in a way that you and I are on the same wavelength. Yeah, I think that high speed running is absolutely crucial for whatever sport you're training, whether clearly if it's a sprinter, but for field sport athletes as well. I know not everybody agrees, and that's okay. And I also think it can be very population specific on that point as well. So, I have researched with a lot of competitive sprinters, but most of the athletes I coach are high school or Division II or Division III collegiate. And I think that perhaps developmental runners need it even more so than elites. Again, reasonable people can disagree there. To me, there is no better way to train the nervous system than high speed running because it is the highest rate of force application. There are other activities you can do, like plyometric jumps, where the pure force is greater. But to my knowledge, no plyometric jump or hop or bound gets you on and off the ground in less than 0.15 second. And even a field sport athlete at top speed is on and off the ground in 0.12. And of course, Olympic sprinters or fast runners on and off the ground in less than a tenth of a second. So the rate of force application, i.e. force divided by time, in this case, is highest in high speed running compared to any other activity. And so for that reason, if nothing else, I think it's just a great way to train. I think that there's just a ton of benefits of doing top speed running, high speed running, even for athletes who maybe their game is mostly acceleration based. To your point that even if for some of our field sport athletes, it's a lot of, multi-directional speed and acceleration and not as much top speed, I would still argue there's a ton of benefit for doing top speed to train the neuromuscular system. And because when big plays happen, a lot of times the big plays are based on whose top speed is fastest.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Yeah. Now, I'm deviating from my script here because you're bringing up some
Sure.
good stuff. There was a study that looked at Usain Bolt, and they said, oh, his ground contact times aren't as fast as the smaller guys. And so that, goes against everything we've heard. But can you kind of comment on that and say that he's obviously putting more force into the ground, but there's other reasons?
Yeah, so I know the study you're referencing. So Bolt is obviously a freak, to use it in a complimentary way, right? There's probably never been anyone like him before, and may not be ever again. He's 6'5", and so that allows him to deviate, at least to a small degree, from the mechanics that some of the other sprinters demonstrate and still run really fast. His contact lengths are longer because he's got longer legs, i.e., the distance his center of mass travels while his foot is in the ground when he's at top speed is longer, just because he's taller. It's as simple as that. So, because of that fact, he can run with slightly longer contact times and still run unbelievably fast, world record fast at top speed. Um, there's no one else in history who's had legs as long as he has, who has been able to spin them as fast, spin the wheels as fast, and apply force as great as forces, while having legs that long. So, Bolt's an interesting one. A lot of times I have people ask me about him and are looking at his mechanics, whether, just qualitatively his technique or, things like contact times, flight times. And I typically, my answer is don't look at Bolt. He's the outlier. And if I'm coaching a young sprinter, I don't want to necessarily train him like Bolt, because guess what? That sprinter's probably not going to be able to grow to 6'5" with, the angular velocities and the force application capabilities that Bolt has. The analogy I use is Barry Sanders. Barry Sanders is arguably the best running back of all time in football, but if I was coaching a little kid to play running back, I wouldn't coach him to be like Barry Sanders. He's not going to be able to do the things that Barry could. I may want to coach him to another type of running style. So Bolt is kind of an outlier. The contact times, yes, I think, without having exact data on Bolt, that they are probably slightly longer than his shorter counterparts that were running at those high speeds. But because he had longer legs, he could get away with it. It comes down to as simple as that. Last thing on Bolt here, his start, relatively speaking, for a guy who's 6'5" is very good. I mean, it's not like he was drastically falling behind at the 20-meter mark. If anything, he was, in the top couple, if I'm remembering my race data correctly, for most of his, world record runs or better performances. And I think that's a fact that's often overlooked. It's not like he was a guy with a great top speed and relatively poor acceleration. His acceleration was actually relatively good for a guy who's 6'5". So.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that was the same with Carl Lewis. People are like, oh, he's horrible at starting. He should work more on starting. And it's like, he wasn't really that far out of it. There were some people who were better, but, it's 100 meters. It's not a 30 meters. So
that's right.
Good point. When we get back into the nerdy research part, if we talk about, there was some mention of all you need is like a good high speed camera, and you can evaluate some of these things that you brought up in the study. Can you elaborate more on that? How somebody can do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, at this point, the camera technology has really come a long way in the last decade. When I was doing my master's study, there was, Casio 300 hertz cameras, which were pretty expensive, and the picture quality wasn't that great, but that was the kind of the best bang for your buck you could get to videotape someone relatively effectively at 300 frames per second. Now your iPhone 6 Plus does it, so you can get high quality slow motion video that has a really good frame rate and accurately get contact and flight times, which if we, like you said, put our nerd helmets on, if we go back to the model, all you need is ground contact time, flight time, and then the acceleration of the lower leg to effectively predict vertical forces at any speed, slow speed to top speed, heel strike, midfoot strike, forefoot strike. The third part of that, measuring the acceleration of the lower limb at impact, me, Peter, and Larry are kind of currently discussing ways to perhaps make that, bring that to the masses, if you will. And without saying anything more, it's not probably going to take anything more than an iPhone to be able to do these sort of calculations, because 2/3 of it is just the ground contact time, the flight time, and then measuring the lower limb acceleration. We used a proxy of the ankle marker decelerating into ground contact. It's pretty powerful, and I think we might be going into some of your other questions, but just to kind of push this to I think where you're going, it's I think pretty powerful from a analysis and predictive standpoint. So if you can do simple baseline testing data of where someone is at a given point in time, whether we're either looking at somebody from a performance standpoint and when we want to analyze where they are as far as their stance average vertical forces. In other words, on any average number of ground contacts, are they applying twice their body weight, 2.3 times their body weight? You'd be able to do that. If you wanted to look limb versus limb, right leg versus left leg, are they applying more force with their right leg versus their left leg, or vice versa? Is the pattern of force application different one limb to the next? In other words, in their right leg, are they applying force like a sprinter, where you get that sharp rising edge of force application? And on their left leg, maybe they're striking a little bit more plantar flexed. It's a little bit more of a mushy ground contact. So perhaps they're not as effective, to use a poor word choice, in applying force with their left leg. So I think there's, from a performance standpoint, all sorts of possibilities there for doing, pre-test, mid-test, post-test, or just at various points in time, and analyzing how effective they are at applying force with both legs. From an injury standpoint, and this happened a couple of times during testing in the lab, we had athletes who would test with us when they were coming off of an injury, and they would, report that they were feeling fine, and they had, been returned to play. They'd met the return to play criteria from the athletic training staff. But when they tested with us and we looked at the force data, the force clearly told a different story. So we didn't tell them what to do as far as, well, you shouldn't go back, or you shouldn't, or you should. We just kind of said, well, here's the force data. You can take it to your athletic trainer if you want, and then you guys can decide as to how that might inform your decisions. And that was fine, but that was from using a force plate. Well, potentially, if you can make those same informed return to play criteria without needing a force plate or a force treadmill, then if you had pre-test data and post-injury data, you could compare the pre versus the post-injury data and have an informed decision on, okay, well, this athlete not only is feeling better and they meet our qualitative return to play criteria, but hey, we have some more quantitative, even if it's indirect measurements of force, more qualitative measurements that are showing us that yes, they are indeed ready to return to play, and we can send them back on the pitch or the field or whatever, and feel more confident that they're gonna not re-injure, whether it's a muscle strain or an ACL, whatever the case may be. I hope I didn't ramble on too long.
That's great. I mean, that obviously leads into our discussion moving forward.
Yeah.
And I mean, all that stuff that you bring up, like, I remember a number of years ago, I was using the same Casio camera, and I'm on the ground, and we had a couple of ACL rehab subjects, and I would have them sprint and then just film and measure ground contact times, but also not just in a quantitative sense, but a qualitative sense, so you could see that on the injured side, rather than cocking that foot and having that elastic response, they would almost plantar flex more and then try to dampen it, right?
Yeah.
So just by sprinting, using that as a diagnostic tool, we were able to say, okay, you're not ready yet until that normalizes more.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, what you just brought up is the deceleration of the lower limb, the ankle, the ankle, so to speak. So what you were already looking at, you had a good intuition, is essentially all that the model uses. It's just, okay, how long does it take? And when we say how long, we're talking, just hundreds of seconds, not,
Yes.
not seconds or hours, right? But how long does it take that lower limb to decelerate? And that's a huge determinant of what the forces into the ground are going to be, and potentially one way you can evaluate, an athlete's performance or injury risk. So
yeah. So having gone through the research side, and now you're putting the coach hat on, how does this research change how you do things as a coach, particularly for a field sport athlete? And what are even the implications for, so maybe even a long distance runner?
Yeah. Great question again. So the majority of athletes I coach are field and court sport athletes, primarily right now, as I mentioned, at Haverford College with Coach Corey Welch, where we're working with the soccer team. And with those athletes, how often do they truly get into their upright front side mechanics? When they need to go, maybe it happens, but obviously to a larger extent, they are accelerating. When we think about what we want to coach, Therefore, to me, it comes down to, okay, we always want you in good posture. We always want to emphasize force into the ground. What can we change with our field sport athletes that's always going to be relevant to them in both acceleration and top speed? It's how they contact the ground. That's the big thing that comes out of the research, is that what these sprinters were doing was cocking the hammer and striking the nail. And what we can really take out of that for our field sport athletes is when it's time to go, we got to make sure that when they strike the nail, so to speak, that they are not mushing into the ground. And it's difficult to do for field sport athletes. Sometimes, as I mentioned, soccer players really struggle with this because they're used to running in that plantar flex, that toe down position. And so we actively coach this with our soccer players and to a lesser extent our lacrosse players, etc. But hey, toe down is great for kicking, not so good for sprinting. When we sprint, we got to make sure we're neutral, we're stiff when we cock our foot to strike the ground. We're not collapsing into the ground, but rather we're reactively popping off of it. This came up in our training session the other day because we train in the wintertime here in Pennsylvania. We train on a gym floor. We should be able to hear that pop on and off the ground. If it's mushing into the ground, that's no good, that sort of thing. So from my standpoint, just to go back to your question, okay, we found that mass one gets rapidly accelerated into the ground by these elite runners and then rapidly decelerated once it hits the ground. How can we take that to our field sport athletes? Let's make sure that when we strike the ground, we are aggressively stopping that lower limb with a really stiff ground contact on the ball of the foot and staying stiff all the way up through the chain, whether it's ankle, knee, hip, torso, shoulders, etc., whether that's acceleration or top speed. So that doesn't change. Whether it's the Olympic sprinters at top speed, whether that's my field sport athletes in acceleration and top speed, that ground contact has got to be stiff at all times. So I think that's probably the biggest application for me. I hope that answered the
Oh,
question.
that's fabulous. That's great. And obviously there's implications for how you run your practice and do your training sessions, and running gassers and things that create a lot of fatigue aren't going to support this assertion that you have here. True?
Yeah, and I don't want to say that we don't do fitness as a component of our training, but I think to me it comes down to stiffness upon ground contact, or whatever term you want to use for it, needs to be emphasized at all times. So there is no portion of our speed training, aside from maybe the fitness at the end, where it's more motivational, I guess you could say, where we are not actively encouraging an aggressive ground contact with an incredibly stiff ground contact. So actively hammering down at the ground, and when you strike, you stay stiff. Whether that's our dynamic warm up, whether that's our marches and our skips and some of the other things we do just at the end of our warm up, our potentiation or our technique drills, whether that's our plyometrics. Yeah, we have our athletes bend to absorb the forces, but we don't have them land soft. We have them land strong. We want them to be able to, not collapse into the ground. Certainly when we go to do our sprints, whether it's linear or multi-directional, everything is with a stiff ground contact, aggressively applying force and not collapsing into the ground, but staying neutral, staying stiff, everything popping on and off the ground. So I think that's probably the biggest thing is there's really nothing we do from a coaching standpoint that it's not emphasized in.
That's awesome. Now, you've done the 3 research papers. What's in the future in terms of the research? What do you want to look at next, I think, if anything?
Yeah, great question. I know at Westchester for me, the next thing will probably be looking at some training studies. So I'm networked with a lot of teams, both at Westchester and at Haverford College, and I love the cross athlete across the spectrum model, similar to the SMU research. And that's obviously from a mechanistic standpoint, that's the way to go if you're trying to highlight the broad mechanical differences between elite, average, and novice, so to speak. I'm interested, probably moving forward and in looking at, okay, how can we take this and apply this with teams we're working with over, 6 to 8 to 10 weeks, and kind of use what we've established now to improve our gains over time. Because really in the high school and the college setting, that's the time frame you have, is typically it's 6 to 12 weeks. How can we kind of use this knowledge and enhance training best in a relatively short time period? Um, Definitely looking both at acceleration and top speed. So also looking, at some race profiling things. Have radar gun and automatic timing system. Have the free lap system. Like I think you might be familiar with, have the ATS stalker radar gun. So some of the work I've done with the track team here at Westchester has been doing some of the race profiling, velocity time profiling, and looking at some of that data. And I probably won't go into too much detail after that. But
Okay.
those are some of the things that are on the table.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I would even like you to look at something like what are the impacts mechanically and from a vertical force production point of view of all this sled pulling and heavy sleds, lighter sleds. Are they useful? Is it creating problems? Obviously, if I take a whole bunch of people who are couch potatoes and make them drag sleds, they'll get better. But
Right.
if we take Usain Bolt and have him pull heavy sleds, what are the impacts, right? So that's I would love to see something along those lines because I don't think that has been answered adequately at this point.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you. And I'm a fan of resisted sprint training, for the acceleration phase, generally speaking. I my master's thesis was on resisted sprint training for the max velocity phase. Now, for whatever it's worth, we found that the athletes who did the resisted sprint training actually didn't fare as well as the athletes who did the unresisted sprint training. Take that for what you will. That was top speed. To me, for acceleration training, it conceptually makes sense. In other words, for acceleration, you got to push back to drive yourself forward. So if we're going to try to overload that modality, having them push back harder could potentially lead to better gains and how hard they can propel themselves forward. But I would agree with you. There's a lot that needs to be researched. I have a few colleagues that are currently looking into it, and I'm really excited to see what they find. The one thing is, I think, it's very population specific, and you've already hinted at this. So we can take untrained athletes and do just about anything with them, and they're probably going to get better. Is that the same for professional rugby players, collegiate soccer players, Olympic sprinters? I think one thing with training studies that's sometimes hard to interpret, and one mistake I unfortunately feel that commonly gets made is over interpreting the results. To me, whatever the results were for that particular study probably need to be interpreted only in the context of that study. In other words, what the results were for a professional rugby team or a college soccer team or a youth football team. That's specific to that group, and generalizing past that group might be a little bit dangerous. But to bring back the point, I fully agree with you. I think that there needs to be a lot more research into resisted acceleration, pushing, pulling, different loads, different populations, and I'm excited to see kind of what comes out of that research. So.
Well, that's great. I want to say this has been a fabulous talk for me. Of course, I'm biased. I fully support everything you're doing. I got goosebumps during some of your replies, so that was awesome. How can people get in touch with you? Are you speaking anywhere? Because I think you have a very good message, and I just want to, kind of promote what you're doing. Are you doing any presentations? Is there any other way people can reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. I am doing a few presentations coming up. Some of them are not open to the public, unfortunately, but I'm probably best reached at just on Twitter. So just Ken Clark Speed, and you can just reach out to me there, follow me there if you have any specific questions. Certainly, if I have any, I did an NSCA presentation just a few months ago. That was my last public presentation. I've got a few that are coming up this spring. But anything that I'm going to be doing publicly, I'll announce over Twitter, over Facebook. So find me, friend me there, hit me up on Twitter, and then I'm always just open to talk shop. So I'm a speed nerd at heart. I love it when fellow speed nerds reach out to me, and I'm always just happy to block out some time and just talk shop because I think it's great. And frankly, I'm just a bad coach trying to learn. So I'm just always trying to get better from others as well. So I think sharing ideas is always great.
Well, that's great. Thanks for taking the time. I know you got to go and educate some young minds, so thank you, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Well, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. Like I said, I could go on with Ken and we could talk forever, but I'm hoping that it he hit some points that'll make you think more about how you train for speed, how you use drills, how you implement your training program, and just how you look at running in other settings. And maybe you'll spend a little more time with some video analysis to see what is actually happening and trying to reproduce maybe what's happening at the higher level with sprinters, with some of your field sport athletes. But hopefully it generated some questions for you, and I encourage you to reach out to us. You can get us on Twitter at Strength Power Speed. That's Strength Power Speed with no vowels, and also Facebook at Strength Power Speed. Also on YouTube, where we'll be releasing the video of this. And you can hit up Ken on Twitter as well, and he had mentioned how you can get in touch with him, and he's at Westchester University if you want to go and visit him and speak to him in person. Really interesting guest to have, and very knowledgeable guy, very likable, very easy to interview. So I'm sure that's exactly how he is in person. So I encourage you to get in contact with Ken, and also get in contact with us if you have any more questions. But thank you once again for listening to our Performance Concepts Chat.